first one, as I was talking with the campus ministers, was just sort of, if somebody's new to this, somebody's learning what it means to be dependent on God, where would you tell them to start? What would it look like to start learning?
That's a good question. I mean, for me, ironically, it's been my own failure and weakness. This is like what we try so hard to avoid dealing with or showing is our weakness, but constantly trying to do the self-image management, I remember my freshman year, I struggled deeply with depression. I knew my roommate, but he was never there. And when he was there, he had hooked up his, whatever it was I think it was Nintendo 64 at the time. That was the cool, awesome. But he had hooked that up to the stereo system. So when he was there, he was playing that jacked up. I was pretty miserable. This is the only person I really knew, and that was my experience with him. You're not here, or you're playing games that I hate. And I remember just feeling this intense loneliness, and I didn't know how to get out of depression. I went, and I remember distinctly going to an RUF meeting, and the message that week was about how you don't have to pull yourself up out of the pit. In fact, you can't. And that Jesus went down into the pit to get you, and that he meets you there. And I remember, I will never forget it. I mean, I'm talking about it now. And so I think that was, for me, that was kind of the beginning of dealing with my stuff and connecting it with the gospel in a way that was you're away from home, you don't have to believe this stuff or live this, but you want to own your faith, and that was me beginning to kind of own my faith. And so, yeah.
Thanks. If you have questions, by the way, that you're a little unsure if you want to stand up and say, or stand up and ask, feel free to text your campus minister or intern or whoever, and they will send them to me, and I will read your question that you do not want to ask. But with that in mind, what questions do you have about everything Joey shared with us this weekend? It's up to you.
So when you were just talking about forgiveness, it just reminded me of something that a problem I had to solve eventually. I'm just wondering, sometimes how you said how God forgives us, how Jesus comes down and brings all the sin away and suffer so much. And I know it's very important to forgive people, but sometimes you feel like you've done a lot, you've done almost not everything maybe, but you've done 80% you could do, and you feel like you can't do anymore. After all, I'm not Jesus, so I feel like I should just walk away. I was actually talking to my small group about this last night. I was just thinking, when it get to the point I feel like I've done enough and I should just let it go and start a new page. How do you feel about that? Should I go back, solve it, or should I just let it go?
I think that the verse that comes to mind is, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And I think there's that balance I think is so helpful. As far as it depends on you, what it's a recognition of, you're not going to be able to live at peace with everyone. Because a relationship is a two-way thing. You can't just enforce peace. Because they actually have to admit that they've wronged you. It's really hard to forgive someone when they're not asking, right? Hey, will you forgive me? And so how do you do that? There's a book called Bold Love by Dan Allender. I would highly recommend you get that book and read it. He deals a lot with that very question. This is something actually I've talked with my atheist, agnostic friends about. It's one of the reasons they say, I just can't do the Christianity thing. Because what they've understood Christianity to be is somehow minimizing or God sort of erasing and pretending everything didn't happen. And that is not what the gospel is asking us to do. There's passages, and I think it's, the Psalms or Isaiah, where it says, God says, I will remember your sins no more. And that doesn't mean God is what? What are you talking about? I don't know what you mean, like you killed someone. I don't know what you mean. That's not what it means. What it means is, I'm not going to bring it up as an accusation on the last day to condemn you. In other words, I'm no longer the judge sitting in like the judgment has already been poured out on Jesus. And so therefore we receive a not guilty even though we are. So I think that was helpful for me when someone explained that to me. Like, it's not saying, no, it didn't really happen. Or like, you know, because that feels like it's minimizing, it feels unjust. Like, does God want us to just be unjust? That's not what God's asking. I don't know if that's helpful, but like, I like as far as it depends on you, do everything you can to be at peace with people. Like, it is kind of like up to you, even when the other person is not responding very well, we still have the responsibility to say, I want to be reconciled, but you can't like change that person's heart, I think is what that's saying, you know?
Yeah, so like when you literally to the point, we should just let it go, right?
There is a point of which, like, the other person has to make a move somehow.
Okay.
And where the point is, that's discernment, you know, like, I think this is why we need wise people in our lives to say, how much do I push, and how much am I actually violating this person's will by like, hey, we need to be reconciled, It's like, you know, if they're not willing to even talk, it's tough to, but I do think we tend to give up too easily sometimes too. So it's like, it's the balance.
Yeah, what if at the point you already give up, but then people start coming back? Like, oh, now I want to talk to you.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't care anymore.
that's when it's just like all of our issues in our heart of like,
Yeah.
I don't actually want to forgive you. I don't really like you very much. But just to know, like, God loves us even when he doesn't, like, really like what we're doing. You know, like, God help me to love this person, you know, because I don't. You know, you can actually pray that. Like, I don't love this person. Like I was saying, you know, the hardest thing is caring sometimes. Like, God, help me to care. Yeah. What's that?
Oh, okay. Hi. Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
I was just wondering, have you, so like when you like pray, you're like chilling in your room, and then like you like do your prayer thing, and like it's hard because like it's like silence, and like nothing really happens, or at least it seems that way, right? Like how do you recognize when a prayer has been answered? Like how do you understand when like God is responding to prayer? Because otherwise it just feels like words into the void, right?
Yeah, it's just like evaporating into the ether. Yeah, sometimes it just feels like that. I love the Psalms because they're so visceral and existential and like gritty, and I also love like books like Habakkuk because the whole book, this is a man of God praying, saying, God, you seem to have left the scene. Where are you? I love that is in the Bible. It helps me deeply because that is often how it feels. And I think it's beginning to see, like, that is sometimes the form that faith takes, is where are you, God? That's actually a faith-filled prayer. Where are you? Why? I mean, you seem to have just disappeared. And that's where I think, like, even knowing that this is Jesus's prayer helps me a lot too. Right? That Jesus is aware of the problem. And like he knows that we live in a world where there's suffering and like evil seems to keep going on unanswered. You know, and there's a really, I think, brilliant biblical counselor that says this, that Christianity is a realistic redemption, and that's why I believe in it, because Christianity doesn't whitewash pain or like, you know, the question of like, how do I know that God is answering it? I think that, again, it's like discernment. Because sometimes the answer is, I love you too much to allow this. Sometimes us getting what we want in our prayers is like maybe sometimes the worst thing but God only knows that. And I think it's trusting his goodness. Like, if it seems that the answer is no, like that he still loves me. And that he's allowing even this for my good. And that's the challenge of faith, of hanging on to faith, I think, you know. Being able to talk about those things, because a lot of times you can't see it yourself, but a friend can see it, you know. like, actually, you seem to be a totally different person, and like, you're really gross, but you didn't see that at all. You're like, no, I'm still the same, like, miserable or whatever. Like, that other person's like, no, I see all these changes. Like, we need community. You just can't do this alone. I don't know if that this addresses it. These are really good questions.
Other questions?
I have a playful question.
You're studying music, correct? Weren't you the one that said, I'm studying?
Yes, I am
See?
working on learning music composition on the side.
It's pretty good. Oh, on the side.
Yes.
What's your main thing?
Math.
Math.
Yes.
That's awesome.
Anywho, so I was wondering, why did someone try and break into your house? And
Awesome.
double pause question, how did you reconcile with someone breaking into your house?
How did I reconcile with them or with the idea that someone broke into my house? Maybe both. So because none of the students that I had are even in this room, I can tell this story because I'm not like shaming anyone. Basically, it was, if you want the full story, I can tell you maybe later in person, but it was just foolish, you know, and it was people who had actually grown up in the church that I attended, that Lucas goes to, and the house where Lucas now lives is actually where I lived, and it was, that house was the property of the church, like, for forever, and these kids had grown up, like, going to youth group there, and it was like their clubhouse, so it was kind of one of these things. It sounds so bad, like, oh wow, they're awful, like, you had terrible students. I mean, in some ways it was like them being a little bit entitled, and not like respecting the fact that, hey, this is like our house. So we were gone for Christmas and they just like threw a party. But it was not fun. I was not happy. And actually the only way I found out is because one of them was just like cut to the heart and like said, I gotta meet with you, and just like burst into tears and was like, this is what we did and I'm so sorry. Like, and so that helped, you know, like. So there was that. That's the short version.
How did you forgive?
Oh, how did I forgive them?
You're screwed.
Maybe not very well. It took me a while. I was not happy. Yeah. And that's again where it's like, I'm not gonna like pretend that it didn't happen. I mean, and I'm like, that wounded me. I think it's one thing to forgive, and then it's another thing to like actually regain trust, to where you're like, hey, trust takes longer. And I think like God knows this. Like, we can't just, you don't invite in an abuser. Like, you might be able to summon up like forgiveness for them, but you don't continue to invite the abuse happening, right? Okay, like, and that's another distinction I think is important.
All right, we have Curtis.
Yeah, so I have a question about the Lord's Prayer part where it says, "Your kingdom come, your will be done," because I know it's been told to pray specifically for, today, sort of for people. So how do you go about doing that without being presumptuous about what God's will is for that person?
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of times, like when we talk about God's will, we talk about it mostly in relation to the specific decisions that we're making. You know, like, God, how do I know your will, like on who to marry or what college to go to or like what town to live in after I graduate, you know? And I think so much of what God's will is actually been made known to us in the scriptures. So like, that's what the word is there for, and the more that we like steep ourselves in it, we begin to see his heart and where his heart goes, like, you know, and so we know that like it's the will of God for to love the stranger and the refugee. That's like in there, like a million times. Right? It is the will of God for us to, submit our plans to the Lord. It's the will of, right? A wise person, I think was it Luther that said this? Like, love God and then do what you want. I mean, and that doesn't mean do whatever you want, but when you love God and when you begin to know, not perfectly know his will, God really does give us an incredible amount of freedom in the individual choices where we live. But then there's wisdom, like, where are you going to live? Don't go live in a place where there's no community, no church for you to be a part of. Don't live in a place where if you're someone who, needs to be around people, don't go live in Kansas. I mean, like God gave us a good mind and let's think through. So I don't know if that's helpful. I mean, how do we know God's will? I think it's also being in community, like I've said a couple times. Just asking, having wise people in your life who you can ask, like, what do you think? Yeah.
Maybe one last question. This is your chance. If you've been waiting.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Max looks like he's about ready to jump out of the seat.
No,
All right, if there aren't any more, that's fine. No problem. Let's thank